Here we go. Okay, let's see what we can do here. Um, one more problem. Fix. Okay, we'll start this over now that you can hear my audio. All right. Today we are talking about the fact that Jesus didn't have to die. This is going to be a podcast, so I'm going to go ahead and start it with the podcast intro. Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast. Today we are talking about the fact that Jesus didn't have to die. This whole area of thinking and understanding is something called atonement theory. And there is this popular idea that Jesus had to die that the evangelicals will promote. The way that is phrased, the title for it is something called penal substitutionary atonement. This is something that a lot of people assume, even if they didn't grow up in the evangelical world, if they don't go to church, because it is something that is sort of the default that somebody has heard at some point, or some commenter on social media has said. And it basically is this, that humanity is completely separated from God because of their sin. And humanity's sin makes God incredibly angry. And that anger is vengeance. That anger requires blood sacrifice. But the problem is that the sacrifice has to be perfect in order to work. And humanity can't be a perfect sacrifice because they are sinful. And the punishment for this is spiritual death. So, what has to happen is a perfect sacrifice has to be offered. Now, that sacrifice comes in the form of God's Son. So, the penal substitutionary atonement says that God sends God's Son to the earth to live a perfect life so that then Jesus can die and his blood sacrifice can be substituted for humanity, that the punishment of humanity is transferred to Jesus. And so then there is no punishment. Jesus's death and resurrection washes the sins away, and humanity can once again be connected with God. The problem of this is that God is kind of awful, right? God seems like an abusive parent, sending God's Son down to be tortured and die a gruesome death. That is awful. And here's the thing, though the argument is simple and is often well constructed by the evangelicals, this is not the only way that the sacrifice of Jesus is understood. There are many, many different ways that the sacrifice of Jesus can be understood. That, I should say, not the sacrifice, the death and resurrection of Jesus can be understood and has been understood since the earliest days of Christianity. So I'm going to go through a couple of those. I'm not going to be telling you which model you should accept, but instead, I really want to show you that the cross has been understood in many ways, many of which are less violent, less legalistic, and frankly, more hopeful than the version that many of us were taught as evangelicals, or you may have heard from evangelical pastors. So as we go along, I'm going to invite you to notice how these models assume the problem is not that God needs somebody to be punished, but something else entirely. That humanity needs healing or liberation or transformation, reconciliation, awakening. And, um, and so we're going to start with one of the earliest ideas. It's something called recapitulation. And this comes from a guy named Irenaeus in the second century. And his basic idea is that Jesus does not just die for humanity. Instead, Jesus is living the human life faithfully from beginning to end and sort of redoes the human story. Like, the idea is that at the very beginning, humanity went off track, and Christ steps into the story to set it back on course. So, in this recapitulation model, salvation is less like a courtroom verdict, like this legal transaction that has to be done, and more like, I don't know, like a medical healing process. Like humanity is sick, distorted, bent out of shape, and Jesus restores what humanity could not restore on its own. So in this way of looking at the cross and the resurrection, the cross is the final moment of faithful obedience that completes this healing work. And then humanity gets the opportunity to enter into this healing, this restoration that Jesus brought through the cross and the resurrection. So this is different from the idea of penal substitutionary atonement, because this is not saying that God needs to punish somebody, that God is a vengeful God, that sin requires death and blood. Instead, this is that humanity needs restoration. And the cross isn't a legal transaction, but sort of the culmination of a life that was lived to repair what was broken. So once Christians began thinking about salvation as healing, they also began thinking about salvation as liberation. So there's another way of looking at the cross from very early on. Early Christians frequently describe salvation using freedom language. And this understanding is called the ransom theory of the atonement. So in this way of looking at it, humanity is trapped in destructive patterns, trapped in systems of injustice, trapped in mortality itself, trapped in the fear of death. And the life of Jesus, the cross, the resurrection is sort of a rescue mission that is meant to set people free. So, like when Jesus talks about giving his life as a ransom for many, the emphasis is not on the punishment, right? The emphasis is on release. The emphasis is on freedom. And so, this idea that something has humanity in chains that create evil, injustice, and oppression, and that God is breaking those chains. And so the way this is different from this understanding of this evangelical understanding of the cross, like penal substitutionary atonement imagines this transaction where somebody has to be sentenced to death and there is blood required. This ransom theory of the atonement imagines instead not a judgment that needs to happen, but a prison where somebody needs to be freed. And I love this because it shifts the emotional tone from guilt and penalty to rescue and liberation. That liberation theme develops into one of the most really like dramatic early Christian interpretations. So we're still in very early Christianity. These ways of looking at the cross and the resurrection have been going on since the very earliest, since the 200s and the 300s, right? And the next one is something called Christus Victor. This Christus Victor theory of the atonement expands on this liberation idea. So in Christus Victor, the cross and the resurrection together represent God's decisive victory over the powers that dominate human life, right? A decisive victory over sin and death, empire, violence, oppression, fear, and like all basically a decisive victory over all of the forces that keep people enslaved. It makes me think of that part from the movie The Matrix, right? Where Morpheus is telling Neo, you are a slave. And you don't even realize it. And that's where Christus Victor is landing. This way of thinking about the cross and the resurrection of Jesus, it says that, like, basically it's like Jesus' death is not the end of the story. The resurrection reveals that the forces that killed Jesus don't ultimately win, right? The sources of empire and death and violence, oppression, fear, all of that, they don't ultimately win. These evil systems may appear to be powerful, but they are not final. This is hugely different from the idea of penal substitutionary atonement that is all about sin, and the sacrifice of Jesus was about dealing with this sinful separation from God, and it pushes this into saying that God is overthrowing systems that crucify people, right? The cross is not a payment. It is a battle scene where oppressive powers are exposed and defeated, right? I mean, there are so many great ways of understanding this that don't end with God being this abusive father figure. And people just don't know about them because they've only heard one, and they haven't really thought that there might be another way. They haven't been exposed to it. So this is really early Christianity. When we move into the medieval period in Europe, thinkers began to explore philosophical explanations of the cross. But those that didn't originally begin with the idea of divine rage and punishment. So one of those that develops is the satisfaction theory of the atonement. St. Anselm focuses on the idea that human injustice damages the moral fabric of creation, the moral fabric of the universe. He says that basically humanity fails to live in the justice and trust and faithfulness that sustain life together, sustain the human life lived in community. And this satisfaction theory of the atonement says that Christ's life and death restore the damaged moral order by offering perfect faithfulness where humanity failed. So, in this framework, Jesus's self-giving obedience restores what humanity has broken. The emphasis here is on restoration, not punishment. And the idea that Jesus' life and death and resurrection is a model. It is an invitation into faithfulness, into restoring what God wants for humanity. So it's not like penal substitutionary atonement that that is like punishment that's transferred from humanity to Jesus. Satisfaction theory of the atonement focuses more on restoring what was damaged rather than executing a penalty. So around the same period in the Middle Ages, another theologian looked at the cross and saw something even more relational. Peter Abelard has this theory of the atonement called the moral influence theory. And he argued that that the cross is the clearest possible demonstration of divine love. And he says this, he has this foundational idea that I think most people have experienced in some way, that humanity changes not when somebody gets punished, but because when you encounter deep, radical love, that changes you. And in the case of the story of Jesus, the radical love will awaken repentance and change, transformation. And this, I think you can have like an insight here from psychology, right? That people rarely become better because they're threatened, right? Like the idea has been debunked a million times over that corporal punishment in parenting actually helps kids change and learn. It doesn't, right? People don't become better because they're threatened or because they are scared. People become better when they experience love and acceptance that invites them into a different way of living or being in the world. So here, it's different from this idea of penal substitutionary atonement, because instead of forgiveness depending on punishment, forgiveness really, it has a completely different function. Like forgiveness is the catalyst that transforms the human heart. The cross becomes the revelation of love rather than the satisfaction of God's anger and wrath. And it becomes that invitation, an invitation to be more loving, to be more like Jesus, to fight for justice and change from a place of love for humanity. Yeah. So then we go forward from the Middle Ages. Later, thinkers want to basically hold together forgiveness and moral seriousness without requiring the idea that Jesus literally absorbed a criminal sentence, right? So there's this other theory of the atonement that comes out of that period called the governmental theory of atonement. And this idea argues that the cross demonstrates that injustice matters and that forgiveness is not trivial. God, in this way of looking at the cross, takes sin seriously while extending mercy, right? There is not a lack of accountability. There's not a lack of taking morality and sin seriously, but there is mercy. In this view, the cross is less like a legal penalty that is paid instead of humanity, and more like a public demonstration that moral order is real and meaningful. So, different from penal substitutionary atonement is that in that Jesus is not punished in humanity's place, like in a strict legal sense. Instead, the cross really upholds moral seriousness as a demonstration while allowing for forgiveness to remain genuine. Then in like modern theology, there's more ways of thinking about this. There's one of them called the scapegoat theory of the atonement. This idea looks at the fact that human societies often maintain unity by blaming a victim, right? We take some person or some group of people and turn them into the other. And because we can point at them and say they are the bad ones, then we that are pointing at them are unified against this other that we have defined. And this scapegoat theory of the atonement, in this theory, the cross reveals that mechanism clearly, right? A crowd, and then political pressure, religious justification of this evil that is being perpetrated, an innocent person being executed for the sake of stability of the empire and of the populace, right? All of that is exposing this mechanism that humanity often uses to maintain unity, right? By blaming a victim, right? In this case, it is blaming Jesus. And what this argues is that the resurrection functions as a divine reversal of the crowd's verdict and all of that injustice. And like the cross is revealing that the scapegoat was innocent and the system is unjust. So this is different from penal substitutionary atonement, obviously, because in that it is God requiring a scapegoat. It is God requiring a sacrifice, a person on which all of the evil can be placed, and then all of the wrath of God can be placed, and that the death of that scapegoat is what satisfies God's wrath, right? That's the penal substitutionary atonement. Whereas the scapegoat theory is saying the exact opposite, that the cross is revealing humanity's tendency to create scapegoats. And in a way, this theory of the atonement is saying, like, look, that whole penal substitutionary atonement theory, that is humanity taking this this very unholy, very unjust tendency to require a scapegoat and interpreting the Bible through that unjust lens, interpreting God through that unjust lens. And the cross is actually there to expose that that is sinful, that in itself is evil and is part of the problem. And then we'll do one more, one that I really like, called the solidarity theory of the atonement. And this is this idea that what we see in the story of the the death and resurrection of Jesus is deep systemic injustice, right? You have Jesus brought up on false charges by a corrupt religious system. Uh, and then this legal system recognizes that, but is also corrupt and unjust. And even though the legal system recognizes that Jesus is not guilty of this, it convicts him anyway and sentences Jesus to death. And Jesus is a victim of systemic injustice, like all of the people that have been victims of injustice throughout history, and all of the people that would be victims of injustice in the future in history. And so what this theory of the atonement says is that what Jesus does here is Jesus actively chooses to stand with the victims of injustice, the victims of systemic injustice and evil throughout all of time. And he is standing in solidarity with them in the cross. He is allowing himself to become a victim of injustice to the utter extent that that injustice can impose the death of a human being, and then exposes the evil through the resurrection. So yeah, there's a bunch of ways to look at the death and the resurrection of Jesus that is not God being this abusive father. That, in fact, is, I think, an exposure of a theological system that is just problematic, right? Like a theological system that relies on a violent and vengeful God is a theological system that can justify violence and oppression as divine. If God wants violence, it is okay for us to want violence. And that can be violence in terms of war, but also violence in terms of emotional and relational violence. And it's so when you view the cross in this God being vengeful and violent and needing a blood sacrifice, it messes with the whole thing. If salvation is about God wanting you to die and then sending God's son, like an abusive father, to pay that price, man, if that's what salvation is about, that's hard to swallow. Like, that's not a God that a lot of people really are interested in or that would see as loving. But so many Christians don't see it that way, don't interpret that way. They find a loving God who is fighting against systems of injustice, that is coming to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, to heal humanity in a loving way. Yeah. So I hope this helps. I hope this has helped you as you are processing your own faith. And one of the things I hope that it shows is that really in every aspect of theology, there are multiple ways of understanding something. And when you find something problematic, it might not be because God is actually an abusive father. It might be that you've only heard one voice on the matter. And maybe it's time to pause and to do a little research, to do a little digging, and to see, are there widely accepted other ways of looking at this? And the cross is definitely one of them. All right, so that's going to be a podcast on the Unbelief Podcast. It's going to be an episode that's going to be coming out tomorrow. But for our live audience, I would love to answer any questions that you might have. it doesn't have to be just about this subject. It can be about anything. If you've ever just wanted to ask me a question, I am live on not Facebook. I'm live on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. You can ask the question. Just put it in the chat there on Instagram or TikTok or YouTube, and I'm gonna sort of flip between all of them and try to answer as many of them as I can. So, okay, so go ahead and place those. There is a little bit of a delay in the different between when I say something and when you put it in the chat. So if you see that, just hang on. It will get to me, and then there will be a delay before I answer it. So yeah, go ahead and post those questions either on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, and yeah, and I will answer those. It doesn't just have to be on this topic. In fact, I'm going to take down that lower third so that it's not confusing. I think I do it this way. Okay, yeah, take that off. And yeah, here we go. So we're just going to do some Q&A here. All right, look for those questions. Okay, finally, my whole life, the narrative hasn't set right with me. As a child, I was told just to have faith, never have seen like God's attribute to me. No, I agree. This idea of a vengeful, hateful God that is needing death in order to be kind to you and help you out, that it just doesn't sit right with a lot of people. Yeah, so Tim Skier on Instagram says, in the end, it was God who was willing to die. Is the idea correct? There's a lot of ways. And I just spent about 45 minutes going through a bunch of different options. That's going to be a podcast episode that'll come out tomorrow on the Unbelief podcast. You can look for that wherever you get podcasts. But yeah, that is one way of looking at it, but there are a lot of ways of looking at it. Any recommendations for books about the atonement? Yeah, none are coming to mind right now. I'll think about that. If you shoot me a DM, I will try to answer that for you. Okay, if you've got questions, you can go ahead and put those in the comments. Yeah, you can go ahead and put those in the comments. I'm going to try to put up a little thing that says, ask your questions, and then post them in the comments. All right, here we go. Look at how nice that looks. Yeah, go ahead and post those questions in the comments. Is it true that the devil is all around us, ready to attack? Well, Laura, the whole idea of the devil is problematic. The evangelical understanding of the devil, because the Bible isn't really clear, it doesn't really have one specific thing. For example, in the Old Testament, Hasatan is the accuser, and it's a role, not a person. You see it in Job. Hasatan comes and makes some accusations about Job. And it relies on this idea of the divine council, which is assumed in much of the Old Testament that there are multiple gods that are all together. And sometimes there's an accuser that comes before the gods, and sometimes that accuser is one of the gods. So there are the idea of like evil spiritual forces for sure. But this idea of the devil in the way that evangelicals often talk about is it's a very difficult argument to make in the Bible, and biblical scholars would say it's not sustainable by the text. All right, you can post your questions in the comments, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. All right, let's see what we've got on these different platforms. Okay. Let's see. Charisse, fundamentalists say God gives common grace to all, the just and the unjust, and also say he is wrathful. Not all fundamentalists will say that. A lot of them will say that that God's grace is available to all, but it requires us to choose to accept that. They do say that God is wrathful, and that's why this the way they talk about Jesus's sacrifice is really problematic, because it creates God as like this abusive father that is not okay. Okay, Kalmish Fish, how did the idea of heaven and hell come about if most of the Bible refers to the place of the dead? The idea of heaven and hell, or hell specifically, in the way that most people imagine it today, really developed, didn't become fully developed until the Middle Ages. And the book Dante's Inferno was really key in solidifying it and bringing the modern idea of hell into the imagination. And so it's not something that organically grew out of Bible study and Bible interpretation. It's something that developed over time and then was catalyzed by this popular, basically novel, work of fiction. Yeah. Would you say you still believe in the Christian God? So I would say, well, one thing I say is that I don't generally share my personal beliefs for a couple of reasons. One, my beliefs are personal, and so I try to offer an academic consensus on things and interpret modern day events in terms of sacred texts. And the other part is because one of my life purpose is to help people find spiritual beliefs and practices that work for them. And if I convey, like, this is the one that I believe, there is this question of loyalty in some ways that enters into the equation, where people will feel like, oh, well, maybe I should, even though this doesn't really make sense to me, maybe I should believe this way because Jeremy believes that this way. I am ordained in a Christian denomination, the United Methodist Church, so that comes with some belief statements and things that I have to support and teach. It is a very open and progressive way of thinking about Christianity, though. All right, Aaron, do I have a favorite biblical scholar or one you would recommend reading their work? Absolutely. And it might come as a surprise, might not come as a surprise, probably doesn't. Dan McClellan, really my favorite biblical scholar. He is brilliant. He is able to take very complex things and say them in normal language. And his new book is the bomb. The Bible says so. It was a bestseller. And yeah, Yeah, I would recommend Dan McClellan all day long. Laura says, thanks for answering. You are so welcome. If you have questions, you can post them in the comments on Facebook and not Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. I do have a very new Facebook page. If you could help me get the follower count up, if you're on Facebook, go find Skeptic Pastor page. It's posting up a bunch of my videos right now to try to drive engagement and share those videos as widely as you can. That would be wonderful. Robert Taylor asks, what denomination are you ordained as? I would like to find a more progressive form of Christianity. Yeah, Robert, I am ordained in the United Methodist Church. One of the things that I love about this denomination is there's a phrase from the founding dead white guy of this stream of Christianity that says, except for that which strikes the root of Christianity, we think and let think. Which the idea there is that that we think, we have our own thoughts, and when other people disagree with us, that's okay. They can think too. We can agree to disagree. In fact, trivia, if you're ever on Jeopardy or something like that, the term agree to disagree, if you go to the OED and look for who coined it, it was that same guy, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. So yeah, I'm full of useless information. All right, Noah, if the universe points to a divine creator, is there any link between that and the Christian God? I would say that science, the scientists that I follow, the scientific consensus would not say that the universe points to a divine creator. Some might say the divine creator could make sense, but ultimately, science doesn't argue for that. So if you're looking for a divine creator, that would be God. But I would say that's not scientific consensus. And for me, when I'm talking about things like the universe, cosmology, I'm looking for cosmologists and not for theologians to talk about that. Yeah, Charisse. All right, let's see it. I love Dan McClellan too. Yep, Dan is great. Laura loves Dan too. Yeah, big fan. I don't know if you guys got, I last year, actually around this time, I got to spend a day hanging out with him in Salt Lake City, and we did a video piece where he fact checked me live and in person. He did an, all right, let's see it right over my shoulder. All right. Net01, did Jesus look up to anyone that inspired him that you are aware? Interesting. It appears that he has a lot of respect for John the Baptist, his cousin. But the other thing is that everything that Jesus says is not new ideas. And so while there's not specific people named, oddly enough, the Pharisees, who are often painted as the like superhero villain, like one-dimensional bad guys in the Gospels, when you understand their theology and you look at what Jesus teaches, Jesus is basically teaching Pharisee theology and pushing back against some of the problems with it. So I guess my answer would be that Jesus looks up to the Pharisees. A phrase I've never considered until just now. If you've got questions, post them in the comments on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. I am answering as many of those as I can. Okay, Laura, does the Bible warn us of demons? Should we be on high alert? High alert, no. The Bible talks about spiritual forces, good ones and evil ones, but very little. There's very little in it about that. What the Bible is mostly concerned about is the way you're living and your choices and being a loving and graceful and peaceful person. And it is people who talk about demons and being afraid of demons um, often are abdicating responsibility for their actions or the actions of other people because like a demon is fighting against you and won. But the Bible doesn't say that at all. Really, the Bible puts all of the responsibility for your actions on you, and you're held accountable, and you're the one that's expected to change and be good. So, high alert, no. Does it say stuff? Yeah, but it says way more stuff about you being responsible for your actions and do your best to live the way that God wants you to live. Tukes asks, why does God allow child, GRAPE, right? I hate that we have to be careful about the words. We definitely have to do that on live streams. If you say certain words, those will trigger immediate shutdown. So, yeah, I don't think I've ever said this online. I'm a survivor of child intimate violence. And so this question about why does God allow that is very personal to me. So I guess my first answer is I don't really have a good answer for it, to be honest. All of the answers that I have feel small and don't really help me. But at the end of the day, the only answer that seems to make sense in any way is that God gives people free will, and people choose to do horrible things. And yeah, it actually is kind of a horrible answer. Twerks, thanks for asking. Okay, let's answer another question. Laura asks, does every human go to heaven? I don't know. The Bible isn't clear about that. Heaven is very metaphorical. There's almost nothing in the Bible about heaven. The requirements for getting there are not really clear, and what it is not really clear. Many people would argue that if Jesus' death and resurrection was about letting people go to heaven, that any limitation, including humans having to accept it, limits the power of it. Yeah, there's a lot of disagreement on that. I don't think there's consensus there. Peaches Art and Stuff. Peaches Art and Stuff on Instagram asks thoughts on Jesus, on the Jesus UFO and abductive connection. This is absolutely the first time hearing of it, but I am really interested in this. I'm gonna have to look at that. If nothing else, but for the wild claim that it sounds like it's making. Yeah. Fala922. What are your thoughts on Satan? Does that figure exist? So I'll tell you, the Bible doesn't really have the idea of Satan as the evangelicals assert it in the Bible. You have several moments, like the actual word Hasatan in Hebrew is the accuser. It's a role that was played in the divine council. So a lot of the Old Testament assumes this idea of a divine council where lots of gods are sitting together. It argues that the God of Israel is the God like over all of the gods, and Hasatan is a role that is played to bring the accusation, like the prosecuting attorney, and that can be a divine being that does that. And yeah, then you have these ideas. Yeah, I've got a whole video on it, but there's just not a solid case to be made for that interpretation of the Bible. Biblical scholars would, the consensus is that the modern idea of the devil is not really supported by the biblical text. So, yeah. Tommy Hall. What? Not sure, Tommy. I know you. You can definitely text me your question if you don't want to put it in the chat. Let's see. More Tukes talking about your essay question. Thank you for your honesty. I wish there was a better answer. Me too. Really. Okay, the UFO thing, right. All right, so we've been going for about an hour. I'm going to try to do one more question. So if you've got a question, put it in TikTok or Instagram or YouTube in the comments and in the chat, and I will try to answer one more of those questions as much as I can. Trying to do as much as I can in an hour. An hour is about all that my voice can handle. And tonight I'm gonna go see karaoke, so I really need to protect my voice. Oh, Tukes, this is a great question. Do all dogs go to heaven? Ah, fantastic question. So I heard a pastor say that that his argument was you have to have a soul to go to heaven, and so the question is, do animals have souls? And then he said, well, God created animals and God created humans, so maybe animals do have souls. And then he said, and also, I don't want to be in a heaven that doesn't have animals or without my dog there. So I'm going to believe, yes, that animals get to go to heaven. And I like that. And if you want to believe that animals aren't in heaven, if you're allergic or something, I get that. But like, I don't know if heaven is going to be so great and God created earth with all these animals. Why would there not be animals in heaven? And why on earth would our important little fur babies not be some of those animals? Okay, so the beginning of this was a podcast recording where I was talking about a deep dive into the video that I made earlier today, which says Jesus didn't have to die for our sins. And I went through a bunch of different ways that Christians understand the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. That is not God as an abusive and vengeful father that needs blood. So that's going to be coming up tomorrow. That's the Unbelief podcast. I really would love for you to get into the Unbelief podcast. It's a lot of fun. I also run a community called Not Church. It's full of people of all kinds of religious identities and non-identities that are there for each other. Somebody said it's like church. People support each other. They talk about spiritual things, but nobody's judging you because you've got a tarot deck sitting on your bedside table. A lot of us in there have religious trauma around being manipulated out of money by churches, and so we don't ask for donations. It's a pay for what you get model. You just go to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/skepticpastor. Patreon.com/skepticpastor. $3 a month gets you in, and if it doesn't work for you, you just stop paying. And if you can't swing $3 a month, I'm never going to stop somebody from being part of a religious community because they don't have expendable income. Just DM me. I will get you in. No questions asked. Yeah. So also, I've got a Substack. It's a lot of fun. And you can go to skepticpastor.substack.com. Check that out. Subscribe to that if you like to read things. That's where I am writing things. So yeah, I would, I'll see you around.